All right. I see a lot of engagement happening in the chat already. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the critical conversation about race and racism in computer science. I'm Anupama Shekhar. You can call me Anu from Microsoft, and I lead the TEALS program under Microsoft Philanthropies. Today's session is intended to be a discussion around how racism is pervasive in our world of CS education. The world has woken up to racial injustice and hatred, and as Dr. Benjamin so eloquently put it in her keynote, the light has been turned on. As CS educators, the issue of racism is living and breathing daily in our CS classes. And we have a group of simply outstanding individuals in our panel today to talk about this crucial issue, and they will share practical examples of racism in our classrooms and how to think about anti-racism in CS classes. We as Microsoft are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We recently put a number of initiatives in place to help to work towards that goal. For the TEALS program that I lead and that I'm a part of, we're expanding our program in about 18 different regions that have predominantly Black and African American populations, and we're looking forward to working with a number of you, a number of CSTA members on that initiative as well. I just want to say in terms of the panel, many of the amazing set of panelists we have here today are part of a program we're proud to be supporting called the CSTA Equity Fellows Program. For those of you who are not that familiar with it, this program is a very selective, year-long program designed to develop leadership in equitable teaching practices and advocacy. It is a privilege to be able to introduce the discussion among pattern makers, to quote Dr. Benjamin again, who I'm sure is going to be quoted a lot today, and welcome. I'm very, very excited to welcome you all to the discussion. I'd like to start off by introducing Shayna, Shayna White, who is the moderator for today. Shayna is a CS teacher at Sweetwater Middle School. She just finished her 15th year of education, teaching currently at the middle school in Metro Atlanta. Shayna believes in purposeful disruption of the status quo in schools and is passionate about equity, race, culturally relevant pedagogy, inclusion, STEM, and computer science instruction at the K-12 level. I'll hand off to Shayna to introduce the panelists to take it from here. We have lost Shayna, so why don't you give it a minute to see if she's able to join back.
Hi everyone, I'm BP. While Shayna comes back on stage, I'll introduce all of our panelists. So thank you, Anu, for kicking us off. Shayna is our moderator, and she will join in just a moment. Along with her, we have Shantae Kostin, who teaches at Shaw High School. If you were just in the keynote, you saw her killer flash talk. She's an intervention specialist turned high school computer science teacher. That is continually expanding the CS program at Shaw. She ensures that our students are exposed to college tours, college fairs, and CS competitions. She believes that every student, especially girls and students with disabilities, deserve to learn computer science. Next up, we have Charity Freeman. She is a CS teacher at Lane Tech High School in Chicago. And she facilitates district-wide professional development workshops for high school teachers around exploring computer science curricular implementation. Charity advocates for equitable access, engagement, and achievement for all learners whose identities and voices have been traditionally underrepresented in CS education, education policy, and teacher preparation. Next is Michelle G. Lee. Michelle G. Lee is entering her 12th year as an educator with the San Francisco Unified School District, where she coaches, co-teaches with, and facilitates hands-on professional development with PK to 5 classroom teachers and specialists. To date, Michelle has introduced over 1,100 children to computer science, lead authored the district's kindergarten computer science curriculum, and is co-authoring the upcoming pre-kindergarten curriculum. Next is Rebecca Luker. She is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation and is a social science teacher that loves to integrate computer science as a means to dig deeper into topics, especially social justice, as a means to, especially social justice and data erasure. In the fall, she'll begin her 15th year teaching, and she's excited to use computer science skill sets to understand bias in social science curriculum. Whew, killer group. Okay. So that we don't miss out on it all this time, I know that Shayna's first question is, when was the first time you were racialized by computers or in computing? Michelle, do you mind starting?
Yes. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. For people who are new to the word racialization, I just wanted to speak just briefly about my current understanding. So my current understanding of racialization means is as other people kind of projecting what you are in a way that you're not defining yourself. So for myself, I define myself as an Asian American woman, specifically Chinese American. And I have a first name that is Michelle and a middle name that is Ji-Yun and a last name that is Lee. And when I was born, I mean, it just right away, my parents had to choose the spelling of my middle name. So in Chinese, you usually use characters, and there's so many different dialects of Chinese. Mandarin, Cantonese are probably the ones that are most well known. But my mom comes from a province called Khoisan, and they use Khoisanese, and there's all different kinds of pronunciations and thus all different kinds of spellings. So just by being born and having to choose an anglicized version of my middle name, I thus became racialized. So I just want to draw attention to any of you who serve children who have an Asian name. The Anglicization of their name is often not an exact match to what their name is. So I just want to raise that point as a point of racialization, is pronunciation of names that we can all really work on in our classroom.
Yeah, maybe if I jump in, again, the question, the first time you were racialized by computers or in computing, when I was thinking about this, it struck me that I was probably racialized without even being aware of it. And so part of it is that, you know, we make the distinction, like in the talk, between the explicit forms of racialization you can see coming at you. You know, it's obvious, you can figure out how to avoid it, how to deal with it. But there's so many subtler things that are happening in our lives that exclude us without us even being aware of it, or harm us, and we don't know the source of the harm. And so I suspect that I was racialized through some kind of measurement, some kind of computerized algorithm, and it happened to me and I wasn't aware of it. I probably felt the effects of it, but I didn't know the source of it. And so I put that on the table just to say that we have to understand that even things that are invisible are part of the framework. And specifically, often we talk about racialization, we look at who is the target of racialization, who is harmed, but not who benefits. That's another form of invisibilization that's part of racism. It's a part of the story, but those who are benefiting from the spikes, those who are benefiting from systems of inequality, they don't experience it as harm. They're reaping the benefits, which means that they're not incentivized to call attention to it or to want to talk about it. If the world was designed for you and those spikes are there to facilitate what you want, then you don't even see it as a spike. You see it as a great design feature. And so again, that's part of bringing into the conversation the things that we often are not socialized or sort of incentivized to pay attention to and to see. So for all of us to think about the spikes that we are not experiencing at spikes. And that also is an invitation to listen to our students, to listen to those who are harmed by particular design features as a source of knowledge about reality, because their experience is a form of knowledge that we need to learn from when it comes to all of the many kind of forms of racialization that impact their lives, rather than impose our experience on them.
That is a perfect off point to the next question, which is giving some examples of those spikes. What are some examples of everyday racism and bias in computing? Rebecca, do you mind starting?
Yeah, so something that was really important in Dr. Benjamin's talk is she brought this concept of deification. So I'm a white-coded member of the Cherokee Nation, and it really kind of got me thinking a lot about when she was talking about IBM and Nazi Germany. In the United States, we have a history of this. So the U.S. Department of Interior was created in 1849. It was created to manage federal lands, conservation, natural resources, and Native Americans. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ended up becoming a part of it. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was created in 1824 as part of the Department of War. So originally, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was under the Department of War, but with the creation of the Department of Interior, it fit under there. And so why I bring this up is in 1902, when my great-grandmother was born, she was born in Indian Territory, her name appears on the Dawes Roll. This was the time frame in which the government decided, hey, we're going to create a process of data so that we can really track you. And so my great-grandmother's name appears, and right beside her name is a fraction. So this fraction carries down our family lineage per the US government. And this whole idea, right, that this fraction is supposed to do is it's supposed to systematically divide us, because am I Native enough? Do I look like other people around me? If my nose bleeds, was that it? And so it's supposed to subtract me out of the system. But this was created by the US government to put onto us as Native peoples of this land. And that is something that when, oh, I'm Cherokee, somebody quickly asked me, oh, what's your percentage? And it's like, and so for a long time, I never talked about it. I never brought it up. I've actually never even taught about it with my students until about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was like, enough is enough. It's time for people to know, and it's time for us to accept and use that in our decolonizing language in our classes. So it is important that we talk about these issues as we head in, because ethical CS is important when we're getting these numbers, because this is what we need to, this is just what needs to happen so that we do not get erased.
Whew, okay, that was deep. I would say that one of the spikes that I've noticed that Dr. Benjamin so brilliantly brought out in today's keynote was the who takes required versus elective CS courses. And I would see that as an example of bias in our computer science classrooms. The underrepresentation of female and non-binary students in our non-introductory level courses is astounding to me. Not in a surprising way, but in a baffling way. The tendency for our students to conclude that's not for me is so many times attributed to the fact that their social identities aren't represented in those spaces. It has nothing to do with their interest or lack of interest, but their sense of a lack of belonging ultimately influences their decision to take those classes. And in my experience, it also inherently presents prevents rather the internalization of the identity of a computer scientist simply because a student that says, I don't belong in that space because my face isn't represented there. And it's not fair in the interest of us, oh, well, that's okay, you'll just be the first. You can be, just one of maybe 2 students in that class, but not every student is willing to bear the burden of tokenization. I don't want to be the only Black person in that class. I don't want to be the only female. I don't want to be the only person who identifies as trans. And it shouldn't, the responsibility of speaking and acting on behalf of every other member of a group that you belong to shouldn't fall on the shoulders of one single person. And it's not a matter of whether or not the student is courageous or even willing to persist, but it's exhausting. Having experienced being the token Black person in a room before, and several rooms that I enter in. It's exhausting and it's harmful.
Yeah, I remember when I was a postdoc at UCLA, there was there is this Institute for Genetics and Society there, and they did this pilot project in one of the predominantly Black and Latinx magnet high schools, introducing genetics, but introducing it starting from the way that genetics intersects with things that students already care about, the things that affect their family members, also drawing upon media, whether it's CSI and other things that are, even if you have a white teacher in front of the room, if the content of the curricula is connected and situated in the everyday concerns and cares and sort of visual culture and all of that, then I think that's also a way to connect. There's different ways to connect, but I think so long as we present it as some thing that's just removed and abstract from and only related to things like recreation and gaming and, that sort of thing, which is also sort of immersed in a kind of white masculine framework, then we don't create the connections that are needed, I think, to avoid that tokenization that you described, Charity.
And I'm going to piggyback off Charity. If people haven't realized, we are each other's spirit animals, so a lot of things we say are kind of interconnected.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but so on my end, as far as the requirement and electives, with AP, it's always the AP honors gifted kids, and they don't, the whole tracking system, they don't put in the schedule students that say, if they need a math credit, give them to me. If they need a science credit, I'll take them. And so I'm actively all the time, pulling kids in. And now that I have, the quote unquote regular ed kids and the students with IEPs, or, the non-traditional AP student, now that they're in the room, more kids are now coming in the room because they see that, yes, this class is hard, but yes, I can do it too. So another big thing is even if you're in a African-American school like I am, there's other subgroups, and like students with IEPs is our 26% of them. We have 26% of our population is a student with an IEP. So I do my best to kind of match the population in the classroom with what's, in the building.
Mm-hmm. I was also thinking about some examples. So the question being examples of racism and bias in computing. And so I am learning a lot and appreciating the examples coming out of CS curricula and pedagogy. I wanted to throw out some examples that really illustrate the stakes of what we're talking about during this pandemic, and the way that the kinds of biases and discriminatory designs that I mentioned in the talk extend to our present moment and have really life and death consequences if we continue the way that we are. And so 2 quick examples. One, when it comes to the vulnerability of people who we have locked up in cages in our jails and prisons, and their vulnerability to the virus because of overcrowding. One of the solutions to that has been to use risk assessment tools to decide who is safe enough, less risky enough to let go home to avoid the overcrowding and the exposure of the virus. And one of the risk assessment tools, one called Pattern, which is like many other risk assessment tools used in the criminal legal system, has built a built-in bias against Black people. And it has nothing to do with the individuals. It has to do with the actual architecture of these algorithms, the way that the things that they are coded for, what they associate with risk. Again, nothing to do with the individual. So for example, if I am from a neighborhood, or if I'm going to be sent to a neighborhood that has a high unemployment rate, that will be considered a risk factor for me. And so consider the levels of discrimination, who's discriminated in the job market, that who's more likely to come from a high unemployment neighborhood, and you build that into the algorithm. And so the people who, and that's just one of hundreds of variables that make it so that Black people, Latinx people in prisons are going to be considered higher risk, not because of their own individual risk, but because they're racialized as part of a population deemed risky. And so with this pattern risk assessment tools, something like 7% of Black men were considered eligible to be sent home during the pandemic, and about 30+% of white men were eligible to be sent home. That's just one example. Another, again, during the pandemic, are the kinds of algorithms used in our healthcare system to decide who is going to get scarce resources, like a ventilator. You know, in the first weeks when many hospital systems didn't have enough ventilators to go around, how do healthcare professionals decide who's going to get the ventilator? The algorithms used by many of our healthcare professionals has a built-in bias towards people who are more likely to survive. That is, healthier people were more likely to get the ventilator. So if you know anything about health disparities in this country, comorbidities, you automatically are taking ventilators away from poor people, from Black and Latinx indigenous people, from disabled people. We have examples of disabled people who already had a ventilator coming to the hospital and having their ventilators taken from them to be given to the majority white male wealthier. And so this is another example of the life and death stakes when we don't think about the assumptions built into these decision-making systems that are impacting people's lives, everything from whether they're going to get a loan or not, a home or education loan, whether released from jail, whether healthcare decisions, whether almost every consequential life decision are being outsourced or at least coupled with automated decision systems in which the people building them have no sense of history, no sense of sociology. And so my proposition is that all of these sort of deep learning systems, right, to draw on the language of machine learning, all of these, if it doesn't have historical literacy, if it doesn't have sociological literacy built into it, it's actually superficial learning. It's not deep learning when it comes to these automated systems. And so that is it's a call to really infuse into our CS training, into our data science curriculum, a more thoroughgoing engagement so that the people designing these systems aren't reproducing forms of inequity, harm that have life and death consequences for people.
Absolutely.
So as a community of K-12 computer science teachers, what can we do? What are some suggestions for using computer science as a tool to combat racism in schools? Rebecca, do you want to start?
Yeah, so, So something that I do, so I'm a social science teacher. I was fortunate enough to have a computer science teacher take a chance on me. When 7th, 8th grade coding became a class, he was like, you keep asking me a lot of questions. You're it. So that's how I came into computer science. But I quickly realized, I'm like, it has a purpose in the social science. I saw where there were some people that talked about teaching history. And this year, in the state of Arkansas, we have African American history, and I got approved to teach Native American history. So we'll be decolonizing and liberating. But something that's really important in that is what can we learn from our history? Why is there such a marginalization? And so creating tools and looking at studies, looking at things that are happening in our schools or in our communities I remember after I started teaching computer science, I was in my econ class. One of my classes I teach is econ. And I was looking at another state's curricula, another state's like teacher pay. And we were converting and looking at, well, what is that teacher salary worth today? And then I was like, let me do my own teacher salary. I found out I was making $4,000 less than what I made 10 years prior. And so the kids all witnessed this. And so the next thing the kids and I just started talking, and I'm just like doing all this math in front of them and doing all this computation in front of them. Next thing we know, we had a study where we pulled up teacher salaries because it's public knowledge. We pulled up their counties in which they lived. We pulled up demographics. We put up that what is the cost of. Next thing you know, we are doing data scraping. We are creating pivot tables so that this information can be easily accessible. And the kids quickly found out the inequities in our own state where, you know, if you were in one part of the state, some teachers were making maybe $2 an hour because of all their other duties on top of what they had. And then was it enough to live? And so these are really great ways of looking at tackling it and giving it as a social change project, because Generation Z wants the social change. Generation Z, they want to be active. They want it to be hands-on, want to be there for this moment. I mean, like if we've seen everything that they've done this past 2 months, they know how to, like, their usage of technology has been absolutely phenomenal to see this. So this upcoming year, in the Native American history class, I get to teach that first. We're going to look at some of the data sets. We're going to be looking at the ways that information has been given to other people. And then when we get to African American history, we're going to be looking at, I'm going to have them pick their own project and what they want to use, you know, computational thinking and figuring out how did we get where we are based off of policies, especially political policies, because again, that intent and that outcome, you definitely can find out that there were some things written into governmental policies back, you know, with the Federal Housing Authority. You know, it intentionally left out African Americans because, again, they were a risk. You know, whenever we look at, you know, like big on this with healthcare, when we look at doctors and doctors' racism, whenever they look at you, oh, they see you as this, but they don't understand your ethnical background because they're only judging you on your race. Mm-hmm. And so this is something that we'll bring into the classroom. And so those are things that can be done. I highly suggest computer science teachers reach out to your social science teachers because we are on a precipice of what needs to happen because Gen Z, they're ready. They're looking to us to provide them the tools. And that's what we have here.
And to piggyback off of Rebecca, since I was a special ed teacher, I was actually in the social studies department. So I still work with the social science teachers. And with the pandemic, they actually came up with an entire project where it encompassed a lot of, it was cross curriculum. They actually included computer science, and that was a big thing, but also a blockchain hackathon when it first came to Cleveland a couple of years ago. And the students, because they had that foundation from the social science teachers, they were able to use blockchain as a way to take care of the abandoned housing crisis. Because within a 3.2 mile radius that is East Cleveland, there's 608 abandoned houses in a 3.2 mile radius. It's probably down to 595 now, but I didn't even know it was that big. And they presented that in front of a panel, and it was students from other areas, and they had no clue that our students had to walk by abandoned buildings and an abandoned hospital, abandoned everything. And that was not only affected them, but affected everyone around them. So that's a great piece.
Yeah.
I'll comment on that question as well, BT. Suggestions for using computer science in K-12 to combat racism in schools. For those of you who were in my previous session today, this will actually give a little bit more insight into why I do what I do. In my classroom, my computer science classroom, I teach, again, high school students at Lane Tech College Prep High School, Chicago. Yeah. Shout out to my loves over there. The way that I typically address all of the isms in my class is by first addressing my students' identities as people. Because before they were students, they were someone's daughter, they were someone's son, they have so many other roles and so many other identities outside of my classroom. But one way that I found that is extraordinarily helpful in addressing oppression and in combating all of the isms, racism, sexism, is by addressing adultism, because every single one of my students, without exception, has experienced adultism at some point in time in their life. And that is a legitimate form of oppression. And for those of you who may not know what adultism is, it is another form of oppression where you acknowledge that a student who is not an adult is therefore not able to make decisions or is somehow less equipped to respond to any of the things that we as adults would. So if you come to a student and say, well, you don't really know what love is, you're too young for that. How do you gonna tell me what I know love is? Just because I'm younger doesn't mean that I don't have the longevity of experience, doesn't mean that I've never experienced it. Another that I hear from my students all the time is students or that children should be seen and not heard. Which,
Charity, can I pause? Can I ask you to pause? Shayna, I think you have to mute because there's a echo. All right, gone. Go ahead, Charity.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I feel that that addressing the issue of adultism in my classrooms is an excellent way for students to be able to first express that they acknowledge, that they understand what discrimination is, and from there, understanding their variety, the reflections of social identities and their variegated places in our classrooms. Who are you? Who aren't you? Who do you, with what groups do you identify? And in what ways have those groups been discriminated against as a process of maintaining the dominant narrative and maintaining dominant identities in society? We discussed the school to prison pipeline, as Dr. Benjamin mentioned, that inequity is woven into literally every single fabric of society. And that includes education, that includes technology, that includes our legal Yes, our legal system. I don't refer to it as a justice system, but I will refer to it as a legal system. When our students, I take my students through the history of American education and social policy. Who were schools built for? The first school was established here in the United States in 1635. As an African-American woman, I got 2 counts against me already. At that time, women were not, and they were not afforded the same luxury of the type of curriculum that they were given as male students. Female students were trained for child rearing and domestication, whereas male students were trained for careers. As a Black person, absolutely not. At that time, the majority of people in the United States who shared my identity as a Black person were slaves. You don't teach a slave to read because they're going to read their way to freedom, and that is not economically sustainable, right? So we have to acknowledge this, the way that education systems are built, the very foundations upon which our schools are built, are ingrained and infused and infected, to use another one of Dr. Benjamin's words, infected with inequity. And I think that's an excellent start, as regardless of the curriculum, but especially in computer science, because we know the outcomes that await our students if they so choose to go into computer science. We know that traditionally underrepresented students in the United States is actually a growing number. Our classrooms are becoming more and more diverse with each passing day. And I'll say diverse in quotes because that means that diversity is really just, I'm so overwhelmed with the foolishness at this point in my life, I apologize. But the diversity is really just an extension of acknowledging whiteness as the center, as the norm, and therefore students who are diverse as a non-dominant group are therefore now qualified as the diverse minority versus the norm, which is whiteness in our schools. But I feel like in computer science, we have even more of a responsibility to educate our students on these things, because we know that at the edge of where we are right now in society and how everything is coming together to form this cataclysmic discovery of where we're headed next, CS is at the forefront of every single one of those front lines. And as CS teachers, we are very much gatekeepers. And that can be a great thing, or that can be an extraordinarily harmful practice that can result in even further inequities, perpetuating inequities for our students.
If I just want to add one, just in conversation with that incredible set of reflections, Charity, I think one of the things I really want my students to take away as they're understanding the scope of the problem is that all of the forms of discrimination that you laid out, both in schools and outside, are the product of human decision making. It's not inevitable that it is the way it is, because I think if my own sort of training was that, pay attention to the social forces, it was diagnosing the problem. And sometimes in that, in sociology, we lose the human agency. Like who were the protagonists? Who were the people, organizations that created that? Because when you begin to do that, then you see, oh, we actually had a choice. There was a fork in the road and we chose to do this as a society when we could have done this. And so when you start pointing out the forks in the road and the points in which we could have created a different public education system, for example, then I feel like that empowers us to make better decisions in the present and to understand that what we're experiencing is not inevitable. And so, for example, the reason why we have public education is, yes, early education was deeply discriminatory by gender and race, but newly, freed Black people are the ones who pushed for education to be a public good. Without their resistance and activism, we wouldn't even have a public education system to begin with. And so that's one of those, the undercurrents, I think. The other, specifically with computer science, is that women were the first computers.
Yes.
So the fact that we have the gender inequity now, actually, that wasn't always the case. It wasn't inevitable that people were pushed out of this field. It's not that you have to do anything special to bring them back. You shouldn't have pushed them out in the first place. And so when you begin to really subvert the stereotypes about who is naturally inclined to love education, you don't think of Black people, first of all. So that means you've erased the history of Black people actually creating our public educational public goods. And then you don't think in CS, you don't think of women, because you've erased the history of women computers. And so again, that's why this is so important to build into, so that you begin to subvert these associations between who is naturally inclined to participate in these fields.
I think we have 5 more minutes, but I just wanted to just formally welcome Shayna back into the room and to just say that the creation of these questions is a lot of the credit goes to you, Shayna. So I just want to say that.
Absolutely.
And I know you weren't prepared to talk about it, but do you just want to talk a little bit about the anti-racist curriculum procedure that we're working on? Because that's something very tangible that educators in this room can take into their classrooms into the fall.
I'm worried about the feedback, so.
It's good now.
It is, okay. So Michelle and I, for our Equity Fellows project, we are both introverts and met kind of ironically at the convening that we had in Chicago, and really gravitated towards each other because we are introverts, and we are both like deep thinkers and processing what people say. And so Michelle works with, I call them the little bitties, but she works in elementary age, and she told me that she had already had a project where she was working on pre-K curriculum for anti-racist computer science. And I was like, this is a really good idea to like make it broader, to go all the way up to middle school. And I was like, but you know what, we need to entwine some other things. Like we need to make sure that it is LGBTQ affirming. We need to make sure that it is anti-ableist, to make sure that all voices are included and all perspectives are included in the curriculum. So she and I worked together the past year, developing kind of like on how to create a curriculum so that you can take any topic in computer science and apply an anti-racist, LGBTQ affirming lens to that curriculum or to that content. I think we're having a workshop for that next Friday. I think BT's going to share that with all the participants. But the thing that a lot of people always seem to forget or not understand is that this is a process. It's not a destination. You don't get there after reading one book. You don't get there after attending one conference session. There's still unlearning that I am doing. And as I talked about in my critical race theory session yesterday, is that racism, like, it has levels. Understand that there's internalized racism that Black people have to deal with and other people of color. But understand that the big one is the institutional and systemic racism. And that is pervasive across all areas of society. And understand that it involves privilege and power. And so I know I mentioned this yesterday, but I want to mention it again. Please understand that racism is privilege and power. And understand that people of color cannot be racist. We can be bigoted, we can be prejudiced, but we don't have institutional or systemic power to enact our racism. And so I want to make sure that everybody is clear on that, because I know that there are people that look at the definition and say, oh, well, this Black person can be racist. No, we don't have any type of systemic or institutional power in order to be racist. I can be prejudiced all I want to, and I can be biased, but I cannot be racist. And the other big thing that I wanted just to mention is, in the part of understanding that it's a journey, is also realizing that you're going to mess up. That you're going to make mistakes, but your job is to not get offended. This is very hard work, and sometimes you have to do it alone. I know I do it alone. I was actually like distraught that I couldn't get on this call, because I just got a call from my principal that a parent from another school has turned in my tweets as being offensive, and the only tweets that I've said are pretty much Black Lives Matter. And so it's been unfortunate that, like, for me as a teacher in a right to work state, that I still get oppressed and suppressed as far as my speech, but I know that I'm doing the right thing, and I know my kids appreciate it and my parents do. So understand that sometimes you have to do this work alone. But find those allies either virtually or in your school building that are willing to do this work. Understand it's not popular. That's the other thing that a lot of educators confuse. It's not popular. People will not like you because you're pointing out injustice and systemic racism on a daily basis, because it's embedded into our educational system. So the minute you decide to talk out about that, just know that you are not going to be liked. You're not going to be favorited. You're not going to be somebody that people are going to be like, oh, Shayna's a really nice person. They're going to probably use some other descriptive terms to describe you. But understand, if you know that you are on the side of right, in the sense of, I want to make sure that my educational system is equitable and accessible for all students, and that all students can see themselves in my curriculum, in my classroom, and their voices are respected and honored. That's all that you're supposed to do as a teacher. And I think if you live by that credence, you won't mess up. But if you do mess up, just understand that bumps are in the road are going to happen, and this work is really, really hard, and you don't get it after one book, one conference, listening to Dr. Benjamin talk one time. You have to continuously do this work, and it's a process every single day.
Absolutely.
I guess I'm supposed to end the panel. Sorry. I apologize. I'm on my phone. I developed the questions. I know that the panel gave y'all phenomenal answers. I'm just truly like humbled that Dr. Benjamin did the keynote for us, and then also joined us on this panel. And then the Equity Fellows, these are my aces. Y'all are doing the work in different parts of the country, but we're all doing the work, and it's great to see y'all all elevated in this platform, but also your work elevated through CSTA. So thank you for joining our conversation. I don't know if we have time for more questions, but I can't see anything except for my big old head. So thank you for everybody. I don't know, like I said, I don't know if there are any questions. Microsoft, hopefully I didn't mess up too much.
We told others that
Microsoft, you're the best. There you go.
Ruha
There's a little
and
plug for y'all.
Shayna
Visit
would
Microsoft.
lead
They help make this possible.
That was amazing. We told others that Ruha would answer questions in the CSTA booth following her keynote. So we should make sure that she can get there, and Shana is going to moderate. Hopefully she can get there as well. So there's a link pinned to the top of the message. You can go to the CSTA booth or go to the expo hall, then CSTA booth, and they'll be there shortly. And maybe some of our other friends can be there as well, so we can kind of continue this session there. Thank you all.
Cool.
Are you on mute, Shanna? Are you on mute on purpose? Are you talking to your kids? She said, I don't know what's going on. That I know.
So.
Okay.
The CSTA booth.
Yes, go to the booth.
Bye, y'all. See you there. Bye.
How do I get to the booth?
How do I get to the booth? It looks like he included. Oh, there you go. He just posted the link again. Here we go.
Please leave the chat up. I'm still trying to read it. I have like BT, like, I don't know what's going on.
Or could we take a little bit?
Do we leave?
Or could we take a little bit? 10 sec. No. Okay, no problem. 10 sec. No. Okay, no problem.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay. I think actually my a little bit. So I'll just smile and give it a try. Oh, okay.